Yeah, so the idea is they may be right, and they is whoever is the other or even the enemy, which is what we'll find out in this case. So it's going to be about how Thomas Aquinas went to search for truth, the trouble it got him into, but how we should probably take a cue from him in our search for truth. So the they in this case is going to be Aristotle. He's the quintessential they. At least in 13th century Christian Europe. In 13th century Christian Europe, there was a thought of the ancients. And Aristotle is one of the ancients. He died in 322 BC, Greek philosopher, noted as a great systematician, was a student of Plato, but his work at the beginning of the 13th century was only known in his logics. He was known as a logician. And so philosophers who dealt in logic were very familiar and very fond of Aristotle. Theologians, not so much so. As a matter of fact, he kept getting banned from theology all through the 13th century. And the difference is, philosophy was thought to be trying to think about the world just with human reason, which Aristotle exhibited very well. Theology is a different sort of science in that it was supposed to start with revelation from God. We know these things are true, God has told us, and then use philosophy from there to systematize, to improve, to fill in the details, because God doesn't reveal everything. So philosophy and theology are different. They begin to have different faculties. Aristotle is allowed to be used in philosophy, but not in theology. Why? Well, Aristotle's philosophy of creation required no God. And in fact, God would be superfluous. God didn't fit in to Aristotle's world. So obviously that's not very attractive to theology that starts with the ideas of God. And he said you could be religious without believing in God, therefore. There's a paper back there on the floor if you want to pick up one. But in the 13th century, new documents become available. Other things that Aristotle wrote that had been preserved by the Arabs, by the Muslims, but were unknown in the West and began to be translated and made available to Christians. So they have a lot more documents coming up. But of course, they're from Muslims and they're by a pagan. So they're really not to be trusted, right? I mean, these are suspect texts. And they're banned to be taught in the theology at Paris. So, of course, Albert the Great introduces them to the theology at Paris, and he starts teaching them. He's another famous Dominican, the teacher of Thomas Aquinas. So he brought and popularized Aristotle to the theologians in Paris. Shame on him. But then Aristotelian doctrines are themselves anathematized in Paris in 1270 and 1277. And supposedly these are the doctrines, some of these were the doctrines that Aquinas taught. Or at least the bishop who anathematized them was trying to anathematize Aquinas and thought he got him on these points. By the second one, of course, Aquinas is already dead. So he's posthumously excommunicated. What does that even mean? Was he really caught up in that or not? That can be debatable. You never name your opponents. You name positions that are heretical. But then by 1323, Aquinas is declared a saint. So he's made a rebound. But it took a while. It took a while. So now, this is what you have in front of you, a page from the Summa Theologica, This is Aquinas' great work. It's a compendium of theology, all sorts of theological views, all in one place rather than pieces, parts. So here's how it works. It starts with objection, objection, objection. Here are other people's opinions that basically Aquinas isn't going to follow. But people say these things and they have these arguments. On the contrary, then it always goes. And this is a quote from someone within the tradition of the church whose voice is an authority. If they say it, it must be true. And then I answer that, and we get Aquinas' answer, what he says, and then, notice, reply to objections. So how does he reply to the people who think different than he does? So let's follow that through. We'll do one first, a simpler one than the one that you have in front of you. It's the first one in the Summa. Do we need theology? Why even bother? What's the right answer? Yes, yes. It's better than philosophy. So some interesting, what he has, the objection, first of all, we don't need philosophy because Sirach in the Bible says, do not seek after things too high for thee. Philosophy deals with things we can grasp with our mind. The Bible tells you, don't try and grasp other things, so we shouldn't do theology. And besides, objection 2, philosophy already deals with everything that exists. There's nothing it doesn't touch, so there's no need for some separate science. On the contrary, right, the source, and in this case it's Paul's second letter to Timothy. He says, all Scripture inspired of God is profitable to teach, to reprove, to correct, and to instruct in justice. Well, the Bible certainly thinks that it's important, that it has something to say and people should study it. So that should settle it. We need theology that starts with Scripture. So Aquinas, I answer that. Well, God, his argument runs like this. God reveals what we need to know for salvation. Because what we need to know for salvation does indeed surpass our grasp of knowing. And even things that aren't really out of our reach, if we use them by reasoning, it takes a long time to get there. And not everybody can get there because not everybody's that smart. And the people figuring out, they might make logical mistakes or other kind of mistakes on the way, so there could be lots of errors with it. So if you start with known things, revelation from God, you just get a better understanding of the world. And so his reply to objections, reply to seek not things too high. We can't find them through reason, that's true, but we can accept them through faith. And for the other one, that philosophy already deals with everything that exists, he says, theology is a better, surer method to even learn about those things. So that's how the Summa works. Some people say this. Here's a question. Some people say this. The expert says this. Here's what I say, and here's the reply then to the objections. It's simple. He looks at the tradition, and then he gives what he considers the synthesis of how we can understand how all of these different voices can fit together now, and then where the problems lie. The problem is, what if sometimes your authoritative sources are problematic, are wrong, are, yeah, so-and-so said this, even the Bible says this, but I don't really think that's right, or there's something wrong with it. How do you deal with those kind of problems, since theology starts with authorities? Well, Marie-Dominique Chenu, one of the theologians important in the Second Vatican Council, a Dominican, wrote a great book on understanding Thomas Aquinas. And in it, he has a section where he talks about how Aquinas deals with his authorities. And specifically this problem, what if the authorities seem problematic? And he gives a bunch of ways that the medievals had, and Thomas Aquinas had, with dealing with problematic statements from authorities. So one is, you can say there's multiple definitions for a word. You know, that word can mean this or it can mean that. So it's using this definition in this instance, not that. Or he'll look at the literary genre. Well, he was speaking poetically at that point, not really precisely. And so we can use it as an image. He looks at the context. Well, that was lifted from a book where he also says this, that, or the other thing. So we have to understand the meaning differently than it makes sense out of just sitting there alone. And then the more interesting, this Latin phrase, it's not that I'm saying something against this, I'm just saying something different. These positions aren't against each other, they're just different from each other. Oh, okay. But sometimes Aquinas is simply going to disagree with a source. All the contextualizing you want to do, the source is saying this, and he thinks this is true. That's when things really get interesting. So he has this word, EXPONERE REVERENTER. And here's what he says about it. Consequently, ancient sources say all sorts of things, some of which a little shaky. Consequently, if in the saying of the ancient doctors we find certain statements that are not worded with as much caution as is practiced by the moderns, euphemism there, right? The statements are not to be treated with contempt or cast aside. They are our fathers in the faith. They are the authorities. Nor, however, are they to be extended in their use. Don't just take them and run because they're wrong. They must, on the contrary, be interpreted reverentially. Interpreted, that is, turned around, but in a way that respects the author. Or in the Summa, he'll say it this way, the holy doctors have sometimes expressed themselves with greater emphasis than strict propriety of terms allows. Again, a euphemism for they're saying something heretical. Whence, instead of enlarging upon such expressions, we should rather interpret them. So I'm going to look at some examples where Aquinas interprets Augustine. Because Augustine, in Aquinas' day in the 13th century, is the theologian par excellence. If Augustine said it, that's it, it's settled. And Aquinas disagrees with Augustine periodically, and still uses him as the theologian par excellence. It's an interesting dance. So, here's an example from epistemology. Let me just tell you, epistemology is the science of knowing. How is it that we know anything? So, who knows who this is? Anyone? Bueller?
It's Da Vinci, Michelangelo's depiction of God in creation.
Yes.
The ceiling of the Sistine.
You can tell it's God because he's an old white guy with a beard, right? God is always an old white guy with a beard. That's why we study old white guys with beards. Or maybe it's the other way around. Anyway, right, this is Michelangelo's picture of creation. And this is God in heaven. And what God in heaven decides to do is create. He's going to create a whole universe, put humanity in there. He's going to create Adam and Eve. He has this idea in his mind that he's going to create. So he does indeed create. We don't need to see all of creation, just the good parts. And he creates Adam. And Adam has a certain nature given by God, right? He's Adam. And he's one of the members of humanity. Like God was intending to make humanity, he makes humanity in Adam. we come along and we look at the world that God created. Now, we can only see the world that God created, right? We can't see God. We can't look with our eyes at the ideas of God. With our eyes, we look at the world that God created. And when we do that, we get a sense impression. So with my eyes, I can see that there are people here. First, I see that there's something, and I can see there's people, and there's multiple people. And that's a kind of knowing. Sensing somebody, what of all our senses do in our hearing and our touch. It's a kind of knowing that we share with animals. Animals have this kind of knowing. So I can see there's something, it's here, oh, it's Adam. I can name that thing. But when we perceive that something here, we go beyond simply identifying the something here. We think further about concepts like humanity. That we're all people, we're all humans. Now, you see, that's something more than this particular human in front of me. And it's something more than what apparently animals can do, because they don't use language, right? So this is strictly conceptual, and it's a derivative from all the things that we see. We can get this idea of humanity, and we can say, is this thing in front of me truly a person or not? And even truth itself is a concept that really we don't think animals have. So these kind of concepts in our mind, humanity and truth, are a little different than concepts like something is here, it's Adam, or this particular person is in front of me. Where do these kind of concepts, humanity, truth, come from? Well, Augustine said, we must be perceiving the ideas in the mind of God. Because remember, those were in the mind of God, and that's how he created the world. How can we see things in the mind of God? Well, there must be, what he says, an incorporeal light, a divine light that shines on the ideas, letting us see them, not with these eyes, but with the metaphorical eyes of our mind. Augustine says this because he's following Plato. Plato said these ideas are what really exist. They exist in a realm all their own, the idea realm, and our mind must apprehend them. Well, Augustine can't allow they just exist somewhere, then they're next to God. Those ideas exist in the mind of God. And we don't just see them with some power of ours. It must be divine light then that allows us to see them. So Augustine is following Plato in this. Aristotle didn't follow Plato in this. Aristotle said, you posit this idea realm, and then you make reference that that's what we really know when we know things. Well, then you haven't explained how we even know things. What is this world all about then? So Aristotle said, no, the forms don't exist in some idea realm. The form of Adam is in Adam. And the form of humanity is part of that, exists there. And we see those things, and that's how we come to know. And Aquinas followed that and posited this thing that he got from Aristotle called the agent intellect. He said by this agent, this active intellect inside of us, we look at our sense knowledge and we derive from that these universals, these unchanging things that match what's in the mind of God because God put them in the world. But we don't get them from God, we get them from the world. So that's how we know the world. There is a part of our intelligence inside of us that mirrors something in the divine. It can create these, discern these ideas, universals, from our sense data. But it's a different scheme than Augustine, right? So now let's look and see, what does Augustine say about this? Well, Augustine would say, we ought rather to believe that the intellectual mind is so formed in its nature as to see those things which by the disposition of the Creator are subjoined to the things intelligible in a natural order by a sort of incorporeal light of a unique kind. See, the flesh sees things adjacent to itself in this bodily light, of which light it's made to be receptive and adapted to it. So this is where Augustine talks about this incorporeal light. And then he says in a different place, God, the intelligible light, in whom and from whom and through whom all things intelligibly shine, which anywhere intelligibly shine. So this seems to indicate that this incorporeal light really is from God. Augustine doesn't develop this idea further. Augustine writes about all sorts of stuff. It's like he doesn't have a unwritten thought. So it seems like maybe he in his own thinking hadn't developed what does that really mean beyond these kind of indications. So today there's disagreement about what Augustine means. But it seems to mean we're seeing the ideas in the mind of God through some divine light. Now the sheets that you have. This is the longer side. So this is in the book 1 of the Summa, question 84, article 5. Got it there? So let's just skip and let's just look at objection 3, because this really does deal with Augustine directly. His answer is going to be no. The eternal types are nothing else but the... so the question is whether the intellectual soul knows material things in the eternal types. The eternal types are nothing else but ideas. For Augustine says that the ideas are permanent types existing in the divine mind. If therefore we say that the intellectual soul knows all things in the eternal types, we come back to the opinion of Plato, who said that all knowledge is derived from them. Well, he was a pagan, right? So we don't want to go back to what Plato says. On the contrary, and then he cites Augustine as if Augustine's going to be on his side. Augustine says, if we both see that what you say is true, and we both see that what I say is true, where do we see this? Neither do I see it in you, nor do you see it in me. We must both see it in the unchangeable truth which is above our minds. It's an interesting argument from Augustine. Now, the unchangeable truth is contained in the eternal types. Therefore, the intellectual soul knows all true things in the eternal types. Makes sense from Augustine's standpoint, right? If we're both going to see each other's arguments as true, or ideas as true, and I don't see your ideas, I can't see inside of your head, we both must be looking at the same thing, the divine ideas. But not so fast. In can be spoken of in several ways, Aquinas says. We can see something in something else, like it's in a mirror, or like it's in the sun. So we could see the ideas in the mind of God as if it's a mirror reflecting the way the world is. No, that's not the way it is. That's the way it is with Augustine, but Aquinas says, no, Augustine couldn't possibly mean that. He means like in the sun. When we say I can't see anything unless I'm in the sun. And how did those eternal types get in Adam? How did Adam become Adam, or Adam become humanity? Well, it's because those types existed in the mind of God and God put them in Adam, that therefore we can see them in Adam. So yes, we see everything in the eternal types, but that doesn't mean we see the eternal types. They just have to exist somehow so that we can see them in Adam. He's accepting Augustine's words and totally turning them on his head. Brilliant. And then to drive it home, he says, well, Augustine didn't understand all things to be known in their eternal types or in the unchangeable truth, as though the eternal types themselves were seen. He couldn't possibly have meant that. It's clear from what he says here that not each and every rational soul can be said to be worthy of that vision, namely the eternal types, but only those that are holy and pure, such as the souls of the blessed. Now this is another quote from Augustine. The interesting part, though, is that what Augustine is actually, when you go look this up, what Augustine is actually talking about is only very few people see everything clearly. That's the blessed. Most of us see just bits and pieces. And Aquinas takes that, instead of we don't see everything, well, see, we must see nothing. We must not see the eternal types at all. Disagreeing with him, but using his words and smiling about it the whole time. If you just read this, you'd never know he was disagreeing with Augustine. Then you read Augustine and you say, what is this guy talking about? He's not like Augustine at all. So let's just look at some of the significances of these differences. So Thomas is undercutting Augustine's position in favor of Aristotle's view, while appearing to support Augustine. That's this interpret reverentially. Never contradict. You may go against, but do it in a way that just reinterprets what Augustine really meant was, even though Aquinas knows this isn't what Augustine meant. He's not a fool. And the people reading him are not fools. They know that Aquinas is playing with Augustine. But that's the way the game is played. What is it by Aquinas? Well, it's a view that the person is self-contained, needing no ongoing connection to God to understand. To understand the world, I don't have to make reference to some special divine light coming on me constantly. God gave us all what it takes to understand the world. And that agent intellect is something like God, but it's part of us. So it's a much more positive view of the human person, like Aristotle. You got that from Aristotle. It's also a more positive view of the world. We really know the world. The world is the place that we live. We're part of it. It's all separate from God and has its own logic and works just fine. Nothing need be added. So let's do another example. And this is the example on the other side of that sheet. The example from original sin. Now before we do, we have original sin, if not everybody knows. So original sin comes from the idea of Genesis, right? We have Adam and Eve here in the Garden of Eden, right? And they're told not to eat from the tree of life, because if they do, they'll know the difference between good and bad, and they'll get thrown out of the garden. So, of course, they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they get thrown out of the garden, and God puts a sword there to make sure that they don't come back. Right? So that's original justice in the Garden of Eden. We were created in original justice, and then we fell from eating the fruit into original sin. So what is that original sin? Well, here's what Augustine will say about it. For it certainly was not just that obedience should be rendered to a servant, that his body to him who had not been obeyed by his Lord. All right. We were servants of God in the Garden of Eden. And we did not obey God. God had one rule, don't eat of that tree, we ate of it. Well, if we as God's servants went against God, our bodies, which are our servants, justly rebel against us. And let me show you how that happens. I want to move my hand, I move it, right? I move my eyes, I move my foot, it moves. My body is in my control. But when it comes to a man's great function of procreation, the children and the members which were expressly created for this purpose, they don't obey the direction of my will. I can't move my members at will. They don't work like a hand or a foot. But lust has to be waited on to set these members in motion as if it had a right over them. And sometimes it refuses to act. And it often goes against the will. That's just wrong. Right? And you can see it's wrong in your body. At least the men can see it's wrong in their bodies. And this is what he calls concupiscence. That inordinate desire, which we call lust, that moves the members created for procreation by its own rhythms, not in control of the will. So then, later in this same work, Augustine says, when we ask the question of how is it that everyone is born with original sin, he says, well, in the process of procreation, it always requires men to use their members, and that always requires lust to get them to work right. So everybody is created through lust. And therefore, now from this concupiscence, this lust, whatever comes into being by natural birth is bound by original sin. So that's how it's transmitted to everyone. Except, of course, Jesus. Because remember, Jesus wasn't born by sex. Mary Perpetual Version, God had a different way of bringing him about so that he was not born with original sin. Brilliant. What is this original justice, original sin? Well, our bodies are like little jets moved by our will. Okay? Our will propels us in a certain direction, and we go where our will tells us to go. It's a little more complex than that, though. Our bodies are more like a train of jets. Because our will is more complex and our body is more complex. It's more kind of dispersed throughout, right? And we have a lot of different smaller wills, and our body has lots of different parts. Original justice, how we were created in the Garden of Eden, in that everything was aligned perfectly. Our will was perfectly aligned with the will of God. And so we went perfectly in one direction, straight towards God, because our wills were completely aligned. What would happen if just in one place our will got out of line? Like when we ate the fruit of the tree that we were forbidden to eat. So that one little piece of will gets turned. Then what happens as you move forward? Oh, look at this. Right? We get all twisted in knots because this affects that and it turns that. And where are you going? You're getting tied in the knots. And that's how we are, right? This is how we feel original sin. Our body is pulling us this way and that way, and our will is tied in knots. I don't even know if I'm coming and going sometimes. So now, let's look on your sheet there. And Aquinas says, I answer that from question 82, article 3. Got that there? Or you can just read it up here. that second sentence there, the formal element of original sin, he says, must be considered in respect to the cause of original sin. By formal here, Aquinas means what's the defining thing of original sin? What sets it apart from everything else? What makes it what it is? That's the formal aspect of original sin. He says if you want to know what it is, look and see what caused original sin. What caused original sin? The privation of original justice. The fact that we weren't all lined up completely and held that way by the grace of God. So, original sin is opposed to original justice, so it has an opposite cause. So, the whole order of original justice consists in man's will being subject to God. And this is subject in the same way that Latin versions of the Bible use, wives be submissive to your husbands. That is, in original justice, we were submissive to the will of God. And that's what original justice was. Original sin is then not being submissive to God. So, that will, being turned away from God, all the other powers of the soul become inordinate. That's that twisting, right? As soon as that gets off kilter, the whole thing starts twisting up. And different parts of the will are pulling us in all sorts of different ways, which takes our whole body and ties it into knots. So, according to the privation of original justice, whereby the will was made subject to God, that's the formal element of original sin. Original sin is really just the privation of original justice, that we're not completely subject to the will of God. And thence everything else follows from there. Well, every other disorder of the soul's power is a kind of material element in respect to original sin. All that being tied in a knot, material element is something that comes along with. It's secondary. It's not the formal element. It's a secondary element. Like, what are some of those secondary elements? Oh, concupiscence. Sure, that comes along, but it's a secondary thing. And so does ignorance, all sorts of things. It's on a list of many things. So I can say original sin is concupiscence, materially, but it's privation of original justice, formally. Does that make sense? He's saying Augustine's right, sorta, not really. He's got his finger on one of the little things that it gets affected as well. He thinks that's the whole thing. We just won't go there. So again, then, Aquinas in his reply to objection 2, he's going to say, yes, concupiscence is how we feel it most. We feel we're tied in knots most because of our lust. And so we can name it after concupiscence, but it isn't really the way it is. But we'll let them get away with calling it that. And we'll let everybody get away with calling it that, knowing that it isn't really the formal element. Or reply to objection 3. He says, hence original sin is called concupiscence rather than ignorance. Because, well, you know, we're also ignorant because of original sin. Why don't we call it that? Ignorance is more important to us than lust. Yeah, that's true. Okay, we could equally call it ignorance. But in fact, we call it concupiscence, so that stands for all the ways that we're messed up. Again, Aquinas totally undercutting Augustine, but doing it saying, oh yeah, sure, I agree with him. And then Aquinas on the transmission of original sin. How is it that it gets transmitted to everybody? Which is a foundational Catholic belief. Well, he'll say, those alone contract original sin who are descended from Adam through the active power of generation originally derived from Adam, that is, who were descended through the seminal power. Seminal power is what we would think of as sperm, and Aquinas would say a homunculus, that is little people. Our whole personhood comes through the male seed being sown in a woman's body. She doesn't bring anything but the ground that you plant the seed in. So it's that seed that carries original sin. That's how it did for Aquinas. And then, of course, remember, Jesus didn't come from one of those seeds, right? So Jesus is, again, immune from original sin. But what about lust? There's a straightforward about that. It's not the actual lust that transmits original sin, which is what Augustine thought it was. For supposing God were to grant a man to feel no inordinate lust in the act of generation, he would still transmit original sin. So there he's just going directly against Augustine. Smart enough not to quote him at that point. Against my colleague, against the Reverend Father. Right? So what are the significance of these differences? Well, again, Aquinas marginalizes what Augustine says in saying what Augustine was calling definitional is really just material. It's one of many effects. And he directly contradicts Augustine's view through transmission, all the time while recognizing Augustine as the authority. But what does it buy him? He keeps the body and soul together. Our bodies are not our slaves that sometimes do our bidding and sometimes rebel against us. Our bodies are us. They're run by our will. It's not us fighting ourselves, it's that we are kind of tied up in knots. Again, it's respecting the totality of the human person. Much more positive view. And then, here's an interesting thing for Aquinas. In the fall, human nature never changed. Right? For Augustine, it had to change because Adam could do procreation without lust. He could just do what he needed to do because he wanted to do it. So something must have changed in humanity after that. Not for Aquinas. We still operate the same. When our will was completely in line with God, we were totally submissive to the will of God, everything worked fine. As soon as that got a little off kilter, we didn't change, but now we operate very differently. And it's that flawed operation that we pass down to everybody. So everybody inherits that flaw through what? Through being born of the seed of Adam. If you're a scientist, that's a Lamarckian view of genetics. All right, conclusions to the whole thing. Whew. For Aquinas, and for all Catholic theologians, certainly in the Middle Ages, but even today, knowledge is held communally. We believe. But it can be improved with ideas brought from outside of the community. And this is something that's unique to Aquinas. So he looks to the history, the fathers of the church, the Bible, what other people have thought through the ages, and brings that in because this is our faith, and these are the experts. But is it simply that we just repeat that and think it's good enough for tomorrow's questions? Or do we go other places that are clearly outside of the faith and see, wow, if that's a good idea, then maybe we should bring it in? We can. We can bring in these ideas from outside. If we do, those new ideas are going to be disruptive of the way we think about things. We're going to understand differently, believe differently, and they're going to be unwelcome. But we should commit to the truth. Let the best idea win. This is the best path to the future. This is how we can think best. This is what our tradition really needs, is for people to go with the best idea, even if it comes from outside, and deal with the problems reverentially. So this great quote from Aquinas then is how Chenu ended that chapter that I started with. The study of philosophy is not done in order to know what men have thought, but to know how truth herself stands. In the end, it's not what anybody else has thought. What we're really trying to do here is to understand the world that we live in. So that's the presentation. Now let's talk about questions. And the people who need to go can go. You got 5 more minutes. No, you're 5 minutes over. Okay, thoughts? Questions? I need coffee.
How does this bear on the collision between science and faith?
Well, that was getting back to Albert the Great, who was the teacher of Aquinas, and he's the one who brought Aristotle in, not just for philosophers, but said theologians should read this as well. That's the first great mind to say there should be no barrier between science and faith. And Albert the Great is kind of the first modern scientist wanting to test things, to look for what's best, to be rigorous in our thinking. And so that forces him to bring Aristotle into this greater search for truth, which is how theology is seen as the greater search for truth. So it really is to commit to be Aquinas, or anywhere in this line, is to really commit and say, we need to always be searching for the best ideas, so there can be no gap between theology and religion, or philosophy and theology and science. It's a way of knowing. Let's see what it has to teach us. Yes? No? Of course, theology is better.
Well, in a sense, they can't talk to each other, in a sense.
But neither could Aristotle, because he's a pagan who doesn't believe in God. Right? So Aquinas is out reading a pagan who doesn't believe in God and thinks religion, nobody needs it. And he's using those ideas to improve his theology and his understanding of God and original sin. So, I mean, talk about not fitting together, yet Aquinas fits them together. Things do fit. It's a creative leap on our part.
Well, isn't original sin kind of a foreign concept to a scientist?
Sure. It would be a foreign concept to Aristotle as well. Right? He's using Aristotle's idea to rethink original sin, but Aristotle didn't believe in original sin. He didn't believe in that there was a creation. So the fact that the scientist doesn't believe in original sin has nothing to do with whether we use their thought to help us rethink original sin or not. I think actually science is an interesting place to rethink original sin, because I think when we look at science and evolution, there was no time when we were in the Garden of Eden. That, the way I understand our evolution now, our physical evolution now, we were never physically in the Garden of Eden. That's a story that's telling us about something about us, but it's not, there was no time before. We kind of, through evolution, got to where we are now, and this is a state where we're kind of tied in knots. And that's what the story tells us. Well, that's a different way of thinking about the fall and original sin. I get that from science. We haven't, as a church, accepted that as a definitive view, but I'm not a heretic, therefore. Just fringe.
I appreciate what Aquinas is trying to do in terms of bringing ideas in a way that's acceptable. But, you know, I spent a lot of my professional career thinking about arguments from authority and why they work, both in personal life and in other places. And it really bothers me that he's doing this. I mean, if an argument from authority has any value, it's because you're accurately reproducing what the authority has said. And there's a transmission of knowledge from someone who has either the competence or experience to be an authority to other people. And we do this, and we have to do this all the time. I mean, we're these little tiny creatures of this gigantic universe. We need to rely on one another. And when you break that level of trust in presenting an argument as an argument from authority, when it's not, when you're saying, well, this is what he really meant.
When it's not.
That really worries me. I mean,
Yes.
It seems like you're using an argument format in an illegitimate way. And again, I see the strategic value, especially bringing in ideas that could be shocking or problematic in their original setting. But it seems like there's some basic argumentative structure that he's just treating in a very cavalier way, especially because it was very important within the structure of argumentation at that time.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things I want to say. One is that, but it reminds us that even arguments from authority, there's no authority that knows everything, that could speak it in words. And so authorities, in some sense, always have to be interpreted and sometimes have to be corrected. Because at least if we're Christian, we don't think God dictated. Right? The Quran could be thought of as the dictated word of God, no errors at all. That isn't how we see Scripture.
Graham once said every semicolon was written by God. For semicolons were only invented
Okay.
in the Renaissance, so about that.
Catholics. Okay, I'm giving you a Catholic view. God didn't dictate.
Just don't go off on the Muslim.
Okay, not unknown to yes. But the other question is, it bothers me too that it seems like Aquinas is misrepresenting the facts. He's lying. And I brought that up to Tom O'Mara last night, and Tom said, well, everybody lies. Look, even Jesus said, I've come not to abolish the law, not to change anything. Well, I thought, that's a pretty good example. I mean, this is just the way things actually work, and this neat and tidy way that sometimes we get in our mind the way things should work, or the way little kids think they work. You know, my dad knew everything. He knew everything. Oh, well, I come to find out that ain't so. And reality is always more complex. And so I agree, it's disturbing to me too, especially when I saw him undercutting Augustine with a smile. Like, he's lying. He's just misrepresenting the facts. Oh, but for a reason. And it works, and he's making a coherent argument. Okay, it's uncomfortable, but I see that's the way it is.
Yeah, tipping your hand a little bit and saying something a little bit more about the value of the authority, I guess, but that's the disturbing part. You don't want to undermine that.
Yeah, but nor do I want to glorify it completely. There is no slam dunk with the argument from authority. And we sometimes think there should be.
It should be the first word, but not the last word.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think it is authority, that there are lots of different kinds of authority. And with Thomas, with Augustine, with each of us, we have to, as adults, come to our own authority and our own sense of authority. So that's how I would interpret that as he's playing around with the words and playing around with the argumentation, that Augustine, Thomas, Albert, all of them had come to some sense of their own personal truth and authority, and that they had a word to share, a truth to share, just like we're doing here at Edgewood College with instructors who have some words to share with students.
Yeah, and let's see, interestingly, Aquinas then becomes the authority. I mean, I think as a community, we have to have noted authorities. These are the ones that we look to, and that's part of what makes us an us. But then that changes and morphs through the thing. So Aquinas has now become the authority, the one, oh, but he said, but then he said women were misbegotten men. So, oh, maybe we don't have to follow him on that one. He's the authority, but maybe not on everything.
So in looking at sort of almost this truth and knowledge is sort of the supreme authority. But I find that a little problematic in getting at his trying to sort of reunite body and soul again. When you make truth and knowledge sort of supreme, that puts it in the realm of the head. I mean, they wouldn't have thought of it as the head, I guess, at that time, but the intellect. And where does like relationship and love, that seems lesser to me, and I find that problematic. Like, where's the gut? Where's what we feel? Cannot God act through that? What would you say to that?
The short answer would be, Aquinas would say, no, I have a place for all of that,
But it's less.
but it's lesser, and so we wouldn't be quite satisfied with his view. And this is one of the things, one of the places where I think we have found that his thinking has its limits, because it isn't relational enough, that it doesn't take seriously enough the fact of, but love and how we get along with the people that we love is just as important to us as knowing the truth. Having good relationships with people, that's just as important as knowing the truth. And for Aquinas, it really is, knowledge is the greatest truth.
And how did he come there? How did just love and relationship just get put down on the side like that?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe because he was so smart, right? I mean, he could see things that other people couldn't. And he has this idea of heaven then. His idea of heaven is what I would characterize as a divine gaze. Like,
Right.
and we just stare at God who is and then we don't even see other things because they're reflected in God, and God made them, and so we just see everything in God.
Yeah.
Well, that doesn't do me.
Right. But this is the model, and often I think in the university system, we're skewed toward this model. So how do we sort of compensate for that, recognizing how important this truth and knowledge is, but still...
We make campus ministry an equal department.
Okay, there you go.
John?
This follows Aristotle, right? I mean, you look at the thing that's most typical or unique, actually, to the species, right? And so, as you were pointing out earlier, effective bonds are something that your dog can have with other dogs and people and stuff.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make it as uniquely human. So you find the thing that's uniquely human in representing what the abstract to yourself in a way that you can manipulate it, pose to yourself states of affairs that don't exist and maybe never will, things like that. Those are the things that are just completely different from what any other kind of animal can do, and are more partake of the divine. So I mean, that's even Aristotle says that, even though his sense of the divine is very different. And
Yeah.
I think Aquinas is following him in that.
Yeah.
Like, where does this motivation come from? It's not because he's like off in his head all the time. It's because he thinks it has something to do with how creation was sort of formed and how it connects with God's own, as a disembodied entity, at least in his.
And we concentrate on the differences, the things that set other things apart. And there's another problem with that in this kind of dialogue, and that's what promotes more problems among Christians, for one thing. We look at what separates us from other Christians, and we pump that up. So we as Catholics, well, we believe this, and those Protestants, they believe that. And we forget, but what's most important about the religion actually unites us all. We're all on board with it's these little things that, and we make those little things big things because we see they're the thing that make us distinct. So that's a problem with pumping distinctions. And it is a very Thomistic thing to do. Any other thoughts?
I was just going to have one response to Kirsten. Remember the motto of this college, cor ad cor loquitur, but heart
Yeah.
speaks to heart.
And